The dagesh. The dagesh is a dot that's placed in a consonant. You've seen this already with what we call the begad kafat letters, and I mentioned offhand earlier that the shurek may look like a doubled vav, that is a vav that has a dagesh in it, doubling it. So we're going to talk more about that here. So here we see David with a dagesh in the initial dalet, as we expect for a begad kafat letter at the beginning of a word, David. But in this middle form, Uzzah, the zayin is not a begad kafat letter. When we see a dagesh in it, as I'll explain more fully now, we say that consonant it indicates doubling of that consonant. So the first syllable uz, second syllable za. And in this third form, the kaf is a begad kafat at the beginning of the form, but the pei, you need to figure out whether that is a begad kafat dagesh or a doubling dagesh. And as you will see in this instance, it is a doubling dagesh. Here's the begad kafats that you learned earlier on. So bait with a dagesh is just bait, but without a dagesh pronounced v. Gimel, maybe with or without a dagesh. In its origins, two pronunciations, something like g and r, but in modern Hebrew with no change in pronunciation when spirantized. And dalet, same things. D, no matter what. But in its origins, distinguishing between a stop d and spirantized v. Kaf, we do hear a difference, k or and pei, we hear a difference, p or f, like an f. Tav, no difference in pronunciation, t, and original th, like thin, but just t. But in any character, including the begad kafats, the dagesh may indicate doubling. So when you see a dagesh in a non-begad kafat letter, you know it must be doubling, right? For maim, for noon, sh for shin. So here in the form uzzah, uzzah. Note that when we divide syllables, we divide between the doubling, which makes sense, as it's the only way to make sure that each syllable begins with one and only one vowel. Begins with one and only one consonant. It's not easy to hide a dagesh in a tzade, but you can see it down there near the bottom of the character. Matzah, matzah. Again, the hey in parentheses only showing us that the h in parentheses only showing us that the hey in this form is not is not a consonant. It's not a consonant that would have been original to the consonantal script for this form, but simply helps to represent the long vowel, the ah, with which the word ends. Kippur. Kippur. Here, you may wonder how we know that it's not a stopped begad kafat pei. The reason is because remember why the begad kafat letters sometimes are spirantized. The reason a begad kafat letter sometimes lacks its dagesh and is spirantized is because it follows a vowel. And when begad kafat letters follow a vowel, they become spirantized, unless they're doubled. Right? So here, all you have to do when looking at that pei and saying to yourself, oh, is that just a regular begad kafat dagesh? Or is that a doubling dagesh? look before it and see what it follows. If it follows a vowel, it's doubling. If it follows a vowel, it's a doubling dagesh for these bagad kafats. So to review on a dagesh may be either a weak dagesh indicating a stop. That's what we call a bagad kafat dagesh. A bagad kafat dagesh we call a weak dagesh. A strong dagesh is a dagesh that indicates doubling. So, in this form, bavel, bavel. We know that the dagesh is a begad kafat weak dagesh because you can't have doubling at the beginning of a word. Why not? Well, because every Hebrew syllable must begin with one and only one consonant. No doubling at the beginning of a word. No doubling. Come on, Pansy. Weak dagesh. That's a good boy. When a dagesh in a bagad kafat letter indicates doubling, it's both stop and doubling because you will never double a spirantized bagad kafat. It makes no sense even to talk about it. So here, zerub bavel. Once we know that it's doubling, right? Because look, it follows a vowel. Once we know that it's doubling, we know that it's also a stop. End of story. You don't have to worry about it being v or anything like that. If it's doubling, it's also a stop. The doubling dagesh is a strong dagesh. And of course, in a non-bagad kafat letter, you'll never have a weak dagesh, but only strong ones. Uzzah. You don't have to ask any questions about that dagesh. It's in a non-bagad kafat. It's doubling. Matzah. To review, before going on with something, you'll remember that you learned about the silent shva. The silent shva marks the close of a syllable and has no phonetic value. That is to say, it's silent. So in forms like ez, ra, or es, ter, the silent shva just marks where there would be a vowel if there were one, but there's not. That is the closing of the syllable. But consider the following forms. Hypothetically, you might read this Shlomo, Shlomo. Shmuel, Shmuel. Kna'an. Note the stress marker. Kna'an. But remember that a biblical Hebrew syllable must begin with one and only one consonant. So in these forms, we know that there is a slight pronunciation to that shva. A slight pronunciation to break up the consonant cluster at the beginning of the syllable. And so we wind up with, instead of shlomo, with shlomo, shlomo, shlomo. Instead of shmuel, shemuel, shemuel. And instead of kna'an, we get kena'an, kena'an. We call this a vocal shva. It will typically mark a place where a vowel in a hypothetical antecedent form of the word has been reduced to near soundlessness. So when you see a shva, it may be silent, or it may be vocal, with just an sound, as in Kareen. So how will you know the difference when you see a word? Well, there are some simple guidelines, and you'll be used to them before you know it. If it's at the beginning of a word, it's vocal, and that's that. Otherwise, the word, and therefore its first syllable, would be beginning with a consonant cluster, two consonants. So here, Bereshit. Bereshit. Occasionally, there's a schwa at the end of a word, only with a few kinds of forms. Usually, a kaf that closes a word will take a silent schwa. Other characters don't do it. Why the kaf takes it and not other characters is a matter of curiosity. But just be used to seeing that in the final form kaf. So here, choshech. Choshech. If it's at the end of a word, it's a silent schwa. You'll never have something like choshecha. Choshecha. Nothing like that. It'll be silent at the end of a word. Sometimes you see two silent schwas in a row in the middle of a word. When you see that, the first one is silent, closing the syllable, just as you've seen at the beginning of other words. Here, yish. Yish. Silent schwa. No problem there. Well, that alone tells us what to do with the second schwa. That one must be vocal. Otherwise, the final syllable of the word would be mru. Mru. And that would be a syllable beginning with two consonants instead of one and only one consonant. So here, mru. So taking the whole word together, yish mru. Yishmaru. Let's practice reading to put these principles to use. Kavod. Kavod. Means glory. Pause when the words come up and practice them on your own before you listen to my pronunciation. Shalom. Shalom. Olam. Olam. Palit. Palit. Yamin. Yamin. Arum. Arum. Bahur. Bahur. All right, here's one of those schwas. Think about where it is at the beginning of a word. So is it vocal or silent? Berit. Berit. Vocal. Otherwise, the word would begin with a consonant cluster instead of one and only one consonant. Similarly, Na'um. Na'um. Gevura. Gevura. What about something else to learn is that there are these characters called gutturals. Ayin, chet, hey, and aleph are all gutturals pronounced at the back of the throat. These four are the only four characters that we call gutturals. They prefer A-class vowels and tend to draw them. This makes sense. You pronounce them with your mouth wide open, and that causes your mouth to want to say A-class vowels. So when a word ends in an ayin, a chet, or a hey, a sneaky patach, or a furtive patach, tends to sneak in there before that final guttural. So in a word that hypothetically ought to be something like ruch, simply pronouncing the het draws an ah. Ruach, and it's represented with a patach that tries to wedge itself in almost before that consonant. Not re, but rea. Also, gutturals usually don't take simple vocal schwas. We say here never. That's not quite right. You will see it from time to time. But in general, they do not take a simple vocal schwa. When the pattern calls for a vocal schwa, instead you will get what's called a composite schwa. And you can see how it's written. It's written like a combination between a schwa and a short vowel, like a patach, a segol, or a kametz chatuf. So the first composite schwa is pronounced like ah. The second composite schwa, the one with the segol, is pronounced eh. And the third composite schwa written with a kametz chatuf is pronounced oh. So we don't get Elohim and Unatot and Chaverim written with simple schwas, but with composite schwas. Elohim, Anatot, Chaverim. Don't worry about trying to anticipate what words will take what gutturals will take what composite schwas, or what words will take what composite schwas. Just read what you see when you see the words. You remember the kametz chatuf. When you see a kametz, you don't know whether it's a kametz, ah, or a kametz chatuf, oh. A few guidelines. If the scribe has written this little vertical stroke called a metheg, then that means it's a regular kametz, a long kametz, ah. Chachema. Chachema. Not chochma, which is a perfectly good Hebrew word. Chochma means wisdom, but if written with the bridle, chachema, it's a different form, and the scribe writes the little metheg to help us through the ambiguity. Second guideline, if the kametz is written before the composite schwa, then it's a kametz chatuf. So, for example, the name, what you know as Naomi, Naomi. The fact that the kametz comes before the kametz chatuf tips us off that it is a kametz, that it comes before the composite schwa, tips us off that it is a kametz chatuf. Naomi. And finally, in a closed, unaccented syllable, as in several nouns that you've already begun to learn, it'll be kametz chatuf. Here, for example, you can see that kol is an individual word connected to Yisrael, and because it's connected to the word, it does not have its own stress. It shares the stress of Yisrael. So it's definitely a closed syllable and definitely unaccented. It's kol. Kol Yisrael. Some Hebrew names. Avner. Avshalom. Note the silent schvaz closing the syllables in these words. Avner, Av Shalom. Chavod. Chavod. Bin Yamin. Bin Yamin. Gid'on. Gid'on. Devora. Devora. Zkar Yahu. Zakar Yahu. Chevron. Chevron. Yehuda. Yehuda. Yehoshaphat. Yehoshaphat. Note the bridle, the metheg in that initial comments. That tells us it's held open as a long comments. Ya Rav Am. Ya. Actually, that second one should be comments hatuf because it's a closed syllable. Ya Rov Am. Ya Rov Am. Yis Ra El. Yisrael. Yishmael. Yishmael. You'll note that the aleph in this one is completely quiescent. If you're using Xiao's grammar, you can see Chapter 1, Section 12 for the quiescent aleph. Lo Ru Ha Ma. Lo Rucha Ma. Mal Ki Tzedek. Malki Tzedek. Im Ma Nu El. See the doubling of the main. Immanuel. Or Pa. Orpa. Par O. Par O. Tzadok. Tzadok. Shim Shon. Shim Shon. Congratulations. Work hard, take a well-needed break after completing your homework for Lesson 2, and we will see you for Lesson 3. Thank you for listening.